Samuel Weaver was standing at the edge of his field when the fog shifted, and something shifted back, something taller than his barn. The Iroquois had a name for it, the Cherokee had a name for it, and the Paiute buried their dead to escape it. What Weaver saw that morning sits at the center of a five-nation pattern that stretches from the Smoky Mountains all the way to the Great Basin Desert. These legends didn't travel by trade route or migration. They were already waiting, rooted in specific valleys, specific ridges, and specific bones in the ground. Weaver couldn't have known any of that when he stumbled back inside and told his wife what the fog had shown him. He described a shape that moved with weight, not wind, something deliberate, something that knew the terrain better than he did. Across this continent, 5 separate peoples described that same quality. Not a monster wandering lost, but a presence that belonged there. The Iroquois called theirs stone giants, and their stories don't read like folklore invented around a fire. They read like warnings passed down by people who had actually lost someone. What connects Weaver's field to those warnings is older than any written record, and the Iroquois are where that trail begins. The Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, called them Otneyer-head, and they did not speak of them as symbols. These were physical beings, mapped to specific river valleys and forest corridors across what is now upstate New York. The stories describe creatures that rolled in coarse gravel and river sand until their skin hardened like armor, plating over years of deliberate effort. They moved in groups, they hunted human settlements, and they ate what they found there. The oral record on that point is blunt and consistent. Haudenosaunee tradition holds that the stone giants grew so powerful they threatened to consume every living thing in the northeast woodlands. The Creator intervened not with a flood or a plague, but by turning the giants against each other in a narrow mountain pass where they destroyed themselves. That pass has a location. The Onondaga placed it in the limestone hills south of their central fire. What you carry away from that detail is the weight of it. This wasn't a story told to explain thunder or the seasons. It was a warning remembered in geography. The Haudenosaunee encoded the threat in the land itself, and the land still holds the name. Further south, a different nation carved a different giant into a different kind of stone. The Cherokee didn't fear Judaculla the way you fear a story. They feared him the way you fear a neighbor who never leaves. He ruled the high ridges of what is now western North Carolina, a figure so enormous his single step could clear a mountain hollow, and so territorial that entire valleys carried his name as a warning. The Cherokee called him the slant-eyed giant, and his eyes weren't a detail. They marked him as something fundamentally other, something that looked at the world from a different angle than anything human. He hunted the same game the Cherokee hunted, walked the same trails, and he did not share. What makes Judaculla different from a campfire story is that he left something behind. Outside Sylva, North Carolina, a soapstone boulder sits in a field covered in carvings no scholar has fully decoded, and Cherokee oral tradition says those marks are his, pressed into the rock by Judaculla's own hand to claim the land. You can drive there today, stand over that stone, and run your fingers along grooves that a people who survived centuries of erasure still refuse to explain away. The Iroquois giants terrorized villages in the northeast, and Judaculla ruled the southern highlands, but thousands of miles west, the Paiute weren't telling stories about a giant who marked his land. They were burning one alive to keep him out of theirs. The Paiute didn't just tell stories about their enemies, they burned them alive inside a cave and sealed the entrance with fire. The Siteka were described as tall, red-haired, and cannibalistic. A people, the Paiute say, arrived by sea on rafts woven from tule reeds. Every surrounding tribe eventually agreed they had to be destroyed, and the cave was the end of that war. In 1912, miners digging guano from a dry Nevada cavern called Lovelock broke through a layer of ash and found something that stopped them cold. Beneath it lay mummies, some with distinctly reddish hair preserved by the desert air for thousands of years. Archaeologists recovered nearly 10,000 artifacts from that single site, including oversized duck decoys and tools scaled larger than standard human hands. The oral tradition had named the place, described the siege, and even specified the fire, and the physical record confirmed all three. You have to ask yourself what it means when a legend matches the excavation that precisely. The mummies didn't prove giants walked Nevada, but they proved something was buried there that the Paiute remembered with extraordinary accuracy. What the Comanche remembered was different in almost every way, smaller, faster, and somehow more unsettling than anything left in the ground. Not every being in this catalog earned its place by being tall. The Comanche knew creatures called the Nunumbi, and they stood no higher than your chest. What made them monstrous wasn't their size, it was the speed, the silence, and what they left behind. Hunters who encountered them in the open plains didn't describe a lumbering shape or a distant silhouette. They described something that closed distance before the mind could process the threat. The Nunumbi weren't misidentified animals or exaggerated strangers. Comanche oral tradition treats them as a distinct category of being, neither human nor spirit, but something uncomfortably between. They haunted specific terrain, rocky outcroppings, dry creek beds, the broken ground where the plains fold into shadow. That geographic specificity matters, because it's the same pattern every tradition in this catalog follows, a creature tied to a place, not a mood. So the question this forces is an uncomfortable one. If the category of inhuman, persistent, geographically rooted being includes something 4 feet tall, what exactly is the category describing? The Northwest Coast has its own answer, and it's the one that has refused to go quiet the longest. Every tradition we've covered so far reaches back into memory and then goes quiet. But the Northwest Coast never went quiet. The Stainzales people of British Columbia have carried the name Saskets for longer than any written record can reach, describing a being that walks the river fog like it owns the dark. Their neighbors, the Lushootseed-speaking nations, called it Seatko, a creature that didn't just live in the forest, but seemed to govern it, warning people away from certain valleys with sounds no animal could make. What makes the Northwest tradition different from every other giant legend in this video is sheer density. Dozens of distinct nations, separated by mountains and language, converged on the same description without any documented contact. The Cascade Valleys, the Olympic Peninsula, the river corridors feeding into Puget Sound. These aren't just places where the legend lives, they're places where the sightings never stopped. Loggers in the 1920s, survey crews in the 1960s, hikers last year. The geography stays constant even as the centuries change. You have to ask yourself what it means when a living tradition and a modern sighting cluster occupy the exact same ground. 5 nations have now told us something enormous walked their land. And when you lay those 5 accounts side by side, the pattern they form is harder to dismiss than any single story alone. Place all 5 traditions side by side, and something uncomfortable comes into focus. The Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Paiute, the Comanche, the nations of the Pacific Northwest, they never shared a council fire, never traded the same stories across those distances, and yet the shape that emerges is nearly identical. Each tradition places its giants in a specific territory, not scattered vaguely across the world, but rooted to a ridge, a canyon, a stretch of red rock desert. Each tradition describes predation. These beings hunt people, take people, consume people. Each tradition points to physical evidence, bones pulled from the earth, handprints pressed into stone, tools no ordinary hand could swing. And every single one of them records a drive, not a worship. These cultures didn't build temples to their giants. They organized, they fought, and they pushed the giants back. That is not the behavior of people inventing a myth for comfort. That is the behavior of people who solved a problem. Samuel Weaver is still out in those hills, and whatever left that shape in the fog, it hasn't read the history books. Samuel Weaver didn't know about the Siteka or the stone giants or Judaculla's scarred ridge in the Cherokee Hills. He was just a man standing at the edge of his own field, watching something move through the fog that had no business being that tall. But 5 nations across this continent, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, described that same shape, broad-shouldered, deliberate, retreating into the tree line like it had done this before. What Weaver saw wasn't a hallucination, and it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a trick of the morning light. It was the latest entry in a record that stretches back further than any written history this country claims to have. The legends were never warnings from the past. They were field notes, passed down by people who knew exactly what lived at the edge of the world they'd built. Something taller than a barn stepped back into that fog, and the oldest stories on this continent say it's been doing that for a very long time.